Frank Mitchell's weathered hand stopped inches from the German shepherd's cage, his breath catching as those dark, intelligent eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The animal shelter's fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the dog's scarred muzzle and ribs that showed through matted fur. This wasn't just another abandoned dog. This was a creature carrying secrets. The shelter worker dropped her clipboard, papers scattering across the concrete floor as she stumbled backward. "Sweet Jesus, I've never seen him react to anyone like that," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog's tail wasn't wagging. It was perfectly still, like a soldier at attention. Frank's mind flashed to Martha's funeral, to the military chaplain who'd whispered about unfinished business following good men home. The same look he'd seen in that chaplain's eyes now stared back at him from behind rusted cage bars. "I'll take him," Frank said, his voice barely audible above the sudden hammering of his heart. What had brought this dog to him? And what would it cost him to find out? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The broken-down ranch that Frank Mitchell called home looked even more pathetic in the harsh afternoon sun as he pulled his rusted pickup into the dirt driveway, $38 to his name, and he'd just spent $15 of it on an old dog that the shelter worker had warned him about. "That one's been returned 3 times, she'd said, shaking her head. "Too smart for his own good. Makes people uncomfortable." Frank glanced in his rearview mirror at the German shepherd sitting perfectly upright in the truck bed, not panting, not whining, just watching the landscape with an alertness that seemed almost human. The dog hadn't made a sound during the 40-minute drive, but Frank could feel those dark eyes studying everything they passed with the intensity of someone memorizing a route. At 67, Frank had buried his wife Martha 2 years ago after 34 years of marriage that had been the only good thing in his life since Vietnam. The cancer took her slowly, eating away at their savings faster than it ate away at her body. Now the medical bills sat stacked on his kitchen table like a house of cards, each envelope a reminder that he was 3 months behind on the mortgage. His son David hadn't called since the funeral. "Dad's living in the past," he'd told his wife at Martha's graveside service, not knowing Frank could hear every word. Maybe it's time to consider assisted living. The ranch house had been in Frank's family for 40 years, but it looked like a strong wind could knock it over. Paint peeled from the siding like sunburned skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of too many lonely evenings. The barn roof had more holes than shingles, and the few head of cattle he still owned clustered around a water trough that leaked more than it held. "Come on, boy," Frank said, lowering the tailgate. The dog jumped down with surprising grace for an animal the shelter estimated at 8 years old. But as soon as his paws hit the ground, something changed. The dog's head snapped toward the eastern pasture, ears pricked forward, body rigid with attention. He took 3 deliberate steps in that direction, then stopped and looked back at Frank with what could only be described as expectation. "What is it?" Frank asked, following the dog's gaze across the scrub grass and mesquite trees that dotted his property. He'd walked every inch of this land over the years, knew where every fence post sat and every gopher hole waited to twist an ankle. But the dog was staring at something Frank couldn't see, something that made the hair on the back of his own neck stand up. Martha used to say that animals could sense things people couldn't, that they lived closer to the truth than humans with all their complicated thoughts. Standing in his dusty yard with $38 in his pocket and a mortgage payment he couldn't make, Frank wondered if maybe this strange, too-smart dog could see what he'd been missing all along. The first 3 days with the dog, Frank decided to call Rex passed quietly enough, though quiet wasn't exactly the right word. Rex didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't make the usual sounds of a dog settling into a new home. Instead, he moved through the house with purpose, investigating every room like he was conducting an inspection. He refused to eat from metal bowls, backing away whenever Frank offered food in anything but ceramic or plastic. At night, he slept by the front door facing east, positioned like a sentry on guard duty. "You're a strange one," Frank muttered on the third morning, watching Rex ignore the tennis ball he'd thrown in favor of walking directly to the fence line that bordered the eastern pasture. The dog stopped at a specific fence post, sat down, and began to whine, the first sound he'd made since arriving. Frank walked over, expecting to find a rabbit hole or maybe a snake den that had caught Rex's attention. Instead, the dog was pawing at the ground with deliberate, measured strokes like he was marking time. The earth looked different here, slightly sunken, as if something had been buried, and the ground had settled over the years. "What you got there, boy?" Frank knelt beside Rex, running his weathered hands through the sandy soil. His fingers hit something hard about 6 inches down, metal from the feel of it. Working carefully, he dug around the object until he could pull it free. It was a military dog tag, green with age and corrosion, but still readable. SGT, Tommy Morrison, U.S. Army, 1969 to 1970. Frank's blood went cold. He recognized that name. Tommy Morrison had served in his unit in Vietnam, a kid from Oklahoma who'd volunteered for tunnel duty because he was small and fearless. Tommy had died in a firefight near An Khê in 1970. His body never recovered. Frank still had nightmares about leaving Tommy behind. Rex moved 20 feet down the fence line and repeated the same behavior, pawing at another spot with mechanical precision. This time Frank didn't hesitate to dig. Another dog tag. Corporal James Riley, U.S. Army, 1969 to 1971. Frank remembered Riley, too, a medic who'd patched up half their unit before taking shrapnel from a mortar round. They'd shipped his body home to his mother in Michigan. "This ain't possible," Frank whispered, but Rex was already moving to a third location. The dog's behavior was too systematic, too purposeful to be coincidence. He knew exactly where to look, like he'd been trained to find these specific spots. But that would mean someone had buried these dog tags on Frank's property, someone who knew about his service record, someone who knew which names would hit him hardest. By the end of the week, Rex had led Frank to 7 burial sites scattered across the eastern pasture. Each one contained a dog tag from Frank's old unit, men who'd died in Vietnam 40 years ago. The implications made Frank's hands shake as he held the collection of tarnished metal. Someone had been planning this for a long time, mapping his property, preparing these locations with the precision of a military operation. But the most disturbing discovery came on the 7th day, when Rex led him not to another fence post but to the old oak tree beside the barn, the tree where Martha used to sit and read on summer afternoons. The dog began his methodical pawing at the base of the trunk, but this time his whining carried a note of urgency that made Frank's chest tighten with dread. The object buried here wasn't a dog tag. It was a waterproof container, olive green and military issued, sealed with black electrical tape. Inside were documents, photocopied pages with official letterheads, maps marked with coordinates, and a typed note in Martha's familiar font. "If you're reading this, Frank, then Rex found you like I trained him to. The truth about your unit didn't die in Vietnam. Some secrets have been waiting 40 years to come home. Trust the dog. He remembers more than any of us. M." Frank read the note 3 times, his vision blurring with tears he didn't know he was shedding. Martha had been dead for 2 years. She'd died of cancer in a hospital bed, holding his hand and whispering about how much she'd miss their Sunday morning coffee. She couldn't have trained Rex. She couldn't have buried these documents. Rex sat perfectly still beside the oak tree, watching Frank with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold decades of patience. The dog's coat was healthier now after a week of regular meals, revealing silver streaks around his muzzle that suggested he was older than the shelter had estimated. Much older. Frank looked at the documents in his hands. then at the collection of dog tags that represented his dead brothers in arms, then at the dog who seemed to know secrets that had been buried longer than most people had been alive. Whatever was happening here, whatever Martha had set in motion before her death, Rex was the key to all of it. The documents in Martha's container read like pages torn from a nightmare Frank thought he'd left buried in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Photocopied military reports, casualty lists with names crossed out in red ink, and maps marked with coordinates that corresponded exactly to the burial sites Rex had shown him. But it was the final document that made Frank's hands tremble so violently he nearly dropped the entire folder. It was a classified memo dated 1971, stamped "Eyes Only" across the top in faded red letters. The subject line read, "Operation Phoenix, Civilian Asset Elimination, Unit 247th Infantry." Frank's unit, his brothers. The memo detailed systematic execution of South Vietnamese civilians suspected of North Vietnamese sympathies, carried out by American soldiers who'd been told they were hunting enemy combatants. The signature at the bottom belonged to Colonel Richard Hayes, their commanding officer, the man who'd pinned Frank's Bronze Star to his chest and told him he'd served his country with honor. Frank sank to his knees beside the oak tree, the weight of 40 years crashing down on him like artillery fire. Rex moved closer, pressing his warm body against Frank's side with the gentle insistence of a creature who understood grief. The dog's presence was the only thing keeping Frank tethered to the present moment as memories he'd spent decades suppressing came flooding back. The village near An Khe. The families huddled in their huts. Tommy Morrison's voice cracking as he asked, "Sarge, these don't look like soldiers to me." Frank's own voice, steady and sure, repeating Colonel Hayes's orders. "Intelligence says they're VC sympathizers. We follow orders, soldier." The silence that followed. The silence that had followed him home. But Frank remembered something else now, something that had been nagging at the edges of his consciousness for days. Martha's questions after his nightmares, her gentle probing about his service that had seemed like wifely concern at the time. "You mentioned a dog once, Frank. In your sleep. You called for Rex." He'd dismissed it as trauma-induced confusion. There had been no dog in Vietnam, not in his unit. But looking down at the German shepherd beside him, Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Texas wind. The dog's age, his intelligence, his uncanny ability to navigate the property like he'd walked these paths before. It was impossible, but so was everything else that had happened since Frank brought him home. Rex raised his head and looked directly into Frank's eyes with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. Recognition. Forgiveness. Purpose. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, the profanity feeling appropriate for the first time since Martha had made him promise to clean up his language. "You were there, weren't you, boy? Somehow you were there." Rex stood and walked to the eastern edge of the oak tree's shade, where he began that familiar pawing motion against a patch of ground that looked identical to every other square foot of Texas dirt. But Frank knew better now. He grabbed the small, folding shovel he'd started carrying and began to dig with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd spent too many years digging graves. This time, the buried object was larger, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof plastic. Inside was a metal ammunition box, military surplus, containing items that made Frank's vision blur with tears. Photographs of his unit, men he'd tried to forget, smiling and young and unaware of what they were about to become. Letters from home, including one addressed to him in Martha's careful handwriting dated 1970, though they hadn't met until 1975. The letter was brief but devastating. "Frank, if you're reading this, then the plan worked and Rex found you. I've been investigating Operation Phoenix for 20 years, ever since I joined the CIA fresh out of college. Your unit was set up. used as scapegoats for war crimes committed by higher-ranking officers who needed plausible deniability. Colonel Hayes and his superiors have been covering their tracks for decades, eliminating anyone who might expose the truth. Tommy Morrison, James Riley, all the men whose tags Rex showed you. They weren't killed in combat. They were murdered by their own command to keep them quiet. Frank's hand shook as he read the next paragraph. I found you in 1975 because you were on the elimination list. I married you to protect you, Frank. Love came later, but protection came first. I've spent our entire marriage gathering evidence, preparing for the day when the truth could finally come out. Rex is trained to find the evidence caches I've hidden. He's also trained to protect you from the people who killed your brothers and who will kill you if they discover what you know. The final paragraph was written in different ink, added more recently. The cancer is spreading faster than the doctors predicted. I don't have much time left to prepare you for what's coming. Trust Rex. He knows more than he can tell you, but he'll show you everything you need to see. Some secrets are too dangerous to carry alone, but too important to die with. The men who betrayed your unit are still alive, Frank, still in power, still killing to protect their crimes. It's time to come home from Vietnam, all the way home. Your Martha. Frank looked up from the letter to find Rex watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. The dog's mouth was open slightly, tongue hanging out, and for the first time since the shelter, his tail was wagging. Not the frantic excitement of a pet, but the slow, measured beat of a soldier acknowledging orders received and understood. How many more? Frank asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. How many more secrets did she bury out here? Rex's response was to turn and walk toward the barn, his pace unhurried but purposeful. Frank followed, carrying Martha's letter and the photographs of dead men who'd trusted him to bring them home alive. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but Frank felt cold to his bones, as if winter had followed him back from a war that had never really ended. Whatever Martha had set in motion, whatever truth she'd spent their marriage protecting, Frank was about to discover that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Rex led Frank to the barn with the same methodical purpose he'd shown at every burial site, but this time something was different. The dog's ears were constantly swiveling, listening for sounds Frank couldn't hear, and twice he stopped completely, head raised, before continuing forward. When they reached the weathered barn door, Rex sat down and refused to move closer. Frank understood. Someone was watching. The realization hit him like ice water in his veins. If Martha had been right about Operation Phoenix, about the systematic murder of his unit members, then the people responsible were still out there, still covering their tracks, still eliminating threats. And Frank had just become a very visible threat. He backed away from the barn, keeping Rex close, and scanned the tree line beyond his property. Nothing moved in the heat shimmer, but that didn't mean they were alone. Frank's combat instincts, dormant for 40 years, began to surface. Check your six. Trust no one. And assume you're being watched. The first sign of surveillance came 3 days later when Frank drove to town for supplies. A black SUV with tinted windows followed him from his ranch to the hardware store, maintaining perfect distance, professional, military. When Frank deliberately took 3 wrong turns on his way home, the SUV matched every move before peeling off just before his driveway. That evening, his landline phone rang for the first time in weeks. The voice on the other end was professionally pleasant, like a telemarketer who'd gone to expensive schools. Mr. Mitchell, this is Agent Harrison from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We've had some inquiries about your service record, and we'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about updating your benefits package. Frank had hung up without responding, but not before noting that the caller had used his Vietnam-era rank, Sergeant, which wasn't in any public records. They knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Rex's behavior grew increasingly agitated as the surveillance intensified. The dog had stopped eating regularly and spent his nights pacing the perimeter of the house, occasionally emitting low growls at shadows that seemed empty to Frank. But Frank had learned to trust Rex's instincts. If the dog sensed danger, danger was coming. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Tuesday morning when Rex led Frank to the back corner of the eastern pasture, near a cluster of mesquite trees that Frank had always intended to clear, but never gotten around to. This burial site was different from the others, larger, deeper, and containing something that made Frank's hands shake as he lifted it from the earth. It was a leather satchel, military-issued and surprisingly well-preserved, containing documents that proved Martha's investigation had gone far deeper than Frank had imagined. Personnel files, financial records, and photographs that connected Operation Phoenix to a conspiracy reaching from Vietnam to Washington, D.C., to modern-day Black Ops programs. The photographs were the most damning. Colonel Hayes shaking hands with defense contractors. Hayes in expensive suits at charity galas, surrounded by politicians and military brass. Hayes receiving awards for humanitarian service while his offshore bank accounts swelled with blood money. The man who'd ordered the murder of Frank's unit had parlayed his war crimes into a post-military career of unimaginable wealth and influence. But it was the final set of documents that made Frank's blood run cold. Current surveillance reports on Operation Phoenix survivors, compiled as recently as last month. Frank's name was at the top of the list, along with his address, daily routines, and a notation that made his vision blur. Subject shows signs of memory recovery. Recommend immediate intervention before full recollection achieved. They'd been watching him for years, waiting for some sign that he might remember the truth about Vietnam. Rex's arrival had apparently triggered alarms in whatever organization had grown out of Operation Phoenix. They weren't just covering up old war crimes, they were preparing to commit new ones. Frank looked up from the documents to find Rex standing at attention, ears pricked toward the ranch house. In the distance, Frank could see dust clouds rising from multiple vehicles approaching fast down his dirt road. 3 black SUVs moving in formation. "Time to go, boy," Frank whispered, stuffing the documents into his jacket. But as they moved toward the tree line, Rex suddenly veered toward the barn, the same barn he'd refused to approach just days before. This time, the dog's urgency was unmistakable. Inside the barn, concealed beneath decades of hay and farm equipment, Frank discovered Martha's final gift to him. A complete intelligence station hidden in plain sight, with communications equipment, additional document caches, and a detailed escape plan mapped on laminated cards. Everything was organized with Martha's characteristic precision, down to emergency supplies and fake identification papers. A handwritten note pinned to a corkboard like a grocery list contained instructions that revealed the full scope of Martha's deception. "Frank, if you're reading this, they've found you. Rex will show you the escape route. Follow Highway 281 north to the Lampasas River Bridge. Mrs. Henderson at the bait shop has been my contact for 20 years. She'll get you to safety. The truth about Phoenix must survive, even if we don't. Rex knows the full story. Trust him completely. He's been protecting these secrets longer than any of us." M. Frank stared at the note, his mind reeling. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who sold fishing supplies and knew everyone's business, was part of Martha's network. How many others in their small community had been living double lives, protecting secrets from a war that supposedly ended 40 years ago? Rex moved to a section of the barn wall that looked identical to every other weathered board, but when he pressed his nose against a specific spot, a panel swung inward to reveal a tunnel that stretched into darkness. Martha had spent their entire marriage preparing for this moment, turning their ranch into a fortress of hidden truths and escape routes. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the property. Through gaps in the barn siding, Frank could see men in tactical gear moving toward the house with military precision. They weren't pretending to be VA benefits administrators anymore. This was a kill team, equipped and trained to eliminate a threat that had been festering for decades. Frank grabbed the emergency supplies Martha had left for him: water, food, ammunition, and a pistol he recognized as his old service weapon, somehow retrieved and maintained over the years. Rex was already in the tunnel, looking back with an expression that clearly said they were out of time. As Frank crawled into Martha's escape route, following a dog who seemed to know exactly where every hidden passage led, he realized that his wife hadn't just been protecting him from his past. She'd been preparing him to confront it. The men searching his house above weren't just covering up Operation Phoenix. They were continuing it, eliminating anyone who might expose the truth about what American soldiers had been ordered to do in the name of freedom and democracy. The tunnel emerged a quarter-mile away, concealed by a grove of oak trees near the river. Frank could hear helicopters in the distance, sweeping search patterns that suggested this operation had been planned down to the smallest detail. But Martha had planned too, and Rex knew every step of her plan. As they moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the Lampasas River Bridge, Frank understood that his quiet retirement was over. The war he'd tried to leave in Vietnam had followed him home, and now, with a dog who carried impossible secrets and a dead wife who'd spent 20 years preparing for this moment, Frank was going to have to finish what Operation Phoenix had started. The truth was buried all over Texas, protected by a network of people who'd risked everything to keep it alive. And somewhere in the shadows of the defense establishment, the men who'd turned American soldiers into war criminals were still pulling strings, still covering tracks, still killing to protect their crimes. Rex looked back at Frank with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold decades of patience and purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. An old soldier, a remarkable dog, and the ghost of a woman who'd loved them both enough to sacrifice everything for justice. Mrs. Henderson's bait shop sat at the edge of the Lampasas River, like it had grown there naturally, weathered wood and rusted signs blending into the Texas landscape so completely that most people drove past without noticing it existed. Frank had bought fishing supplies there for 15 years, making small talk about weather and water levels with the elderly woman who seemed to know every secret the river had ever kept. Now, crouched in the pre-dawn darkness with Rex pressed against his side, Frank realized he'd never known Mrs. Henderson at all. She was waiting for them on the dock behind the shop, a slight figure in overalls and a John Deere cap, but the way she held herself suggested someone accustomed to dangerous situations. When she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd spent decades coordinating covert operations. "Took you long enough, Frank. Martha said you were stubborn, but I figured you'd move faster with half the government trying to kill you." She gestured toward a bass boat tied up at the dock. "Get in. We've got maybe 20 minutes before their search grid reaches the river." Frank didn't move. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's been keeping Martha's secrets for 20 years while you played rancher." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "CIA, retired. Martha recruited me straight out of Langley in 1985. We've been documenting Operation Phoenix survivors and building cases against the bastards who murdered your unit." Rex jumped into the boat without hesitation, settling into the bow like he'd made this trip before. Frank followed, his mind reeling from the revelation that his quiet community had been harboring intelligence operatives disguised as small-town locals, as Mrs. Henderson started the motor and guided them downstream. She began explaining Martha's network with the matter-of-fact tone of someone briefing field agents. 12 active participants across 3 states. Hardware store owner in Austin, librarian in San Antonio, Methodist minister in Dallas, all recruited by Martha, all protecting evidence and survivors. "How many survivors are left?" Frank asked. watching the riverbank slide past in the gray morning light. 3, counting you, Jimmy Kowalski in Oregon and Pete Murphy in Florida, both under protective surveillance since Phoenix operatives started getting aggressive last month. Mrs. Henderson's voice hardened. Someone leaked that Martha had died and you were alone. They figured it was time to clean up loose ends. The boat rounded a bend, and Frank could see helicopters in the distance, their searchlights sweeping the water behind them. Rex raised his head, ears forward, tracking the aircraft with the focused attention of someone evaluating tactical threats. "The dog knows them," Mrs. Henderson observed. "Martha said he had specialized training, but she never told me the details. What's his story?" Frank looked down at Rex, whose dark eyes reflected the helicopter lights like mirrors. "I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I think he was there. In Vietnam. I think he's been carrying these secrets for 40 years. Impossible. Dogs don't live that long. Nothing about this situation is possible. But Rex knows things no normal dog should know. He finds burial sites like he's reading a map. He reacts to military equipment and procedures like he's been trained for combat operations." Frank's voice dropped. "Martha mentioned him in a letter dated 1970, 5 years before we met. She said he was trained to protect me, Mrs." Henderson steered the boat into a narrow creek that branched off from the main river, following a waterway so overgrown with cypress and willow that it was barely visible from the air. "Martha never told me about any dog, but she kept a lot of compartmentalized even from her own network, especially anything that might sound—" She paused, searching for words. "Crazy," Frank finished. "Yeah, I know how it sounds." They traveled in silence for another 20 minutes, deeper into swampland that felt removed from the modern world. The helicopter's sounds faded, replaced by the splash of fish jumping and the cry of water birds. Rex remained alert but calm, like a soldier who'd reached friendly territory. The safe house was a hunting cabin built on stilts, accessible only by boat, and hidden so completely in the wetlands that it wouldn't show up on satellite imagery. Mrs. Henderson tied up at a small dock, and they climbed wooden stairs to a porch that wrapped around the entire structure. Inside, Frank discovered that Martha's preparations went far beyond hidden documents and escape routes. The cabin was equipped as a communications center, with radio equipment, encrypted internet connections, and filing cabinets filled with evidence that represented decades of investigation. Maps covered every wall, marked with locations where Operation Phoenix veterans had died under suspicious circumstances over the years. 63 men from your unit's extended operations, Mrs. Henderson explained, pointing to red pins scattered across the maps. Car accidents, house fires, hunting mishaps, medical emergencies, all within 6 months of showing signs they might be remembering details about Phoenix missions. Frank studied the maps, recognizing names and faces from 40 years ago. Boys who'd trusted him to bring them home safe, who'd followed his orders even when those orders felt wrong. Now they were statistical markers on Martha's wall, victims of a conspiracy that had been hunting them for decades. "Why didn't you contact me sooner? Why wait until Martha was dead?" "Because Martha was convinced you were safer not knowing. She thought if you stayed quiet, stayed invisible, they might leave you alone." Mrs. Henderson's voice carried genuine regret. She was wrong. The Phoenix network has evolved over the years. They're not just covering up war crimes anymore. They're using the same elimination techniques for current operations: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Any soldier who sees too much, asks too many questions, reports the wrong things. Rex moved to a specific section of the cabin wall where he began that familiar pawing motion that had started Frank's journey into Martha's hidden world. But this time, instead of digging in dirt, the dog was indicating something behind the wood paneling. Frank found the hidden catch and opened a concealed compartment containing Martha's most closely guarded secret, a complete dossier on Colonel Hayes, now General Hayes, retired but still wielding enormous influence in defense circles. Current photographs showed an elderly man in expensive suits, surrounded by politicians and military contractors at Washington galas. The dossier included financial records showing Hayes's transformation from career military to multimillionaire, built on defense contracts awarded to companies he secretly controlled. Phone records connecting him to suspicious deaths of Phoenix survivors, and most damning of all, recordings of phone conversations where Hayes casually discussed eliminating security risks with the same tone other people use to discuss weekend plans. "Martha spent our entire marriage gathering this evidence," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "She married me to protect me, lived with me to investigate Phoenix, and died keeping these secrets. She loved you, Frank, don't doubt that, but she also knew that justice for your dead brothers was bigger than any personal relationship." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a thick folder marked Contingency Plan, Final Phase. "She always intended for you to have a choice, stay hidden and live quietly, or go public and finish what Phoenix started." Frank opened the folder to find detailed plans for simultaneously releasing evidence to major news outlets, congressional oversight committees, and international human rights organizations. Phone numbers for investigative journalists who'd been cultivated for years, legal strategies for protecting whistleblowers, even arrangements for witness protection if the exposure attempts failed. Rex moved to Frank's side, pressing his warm body against the old soldier's leg. The dog's presence was steady and reassuring, like a battle buddy who'd never leave a man behind. Looking down into those dark, intelligent eyes, Frank saw decades of patience, loyalty, and unwavering commitment to a mission that transcended normal understanding. "She trained him to find me, didn't she?" Frank asked. "All those years, Rex was waiting for the right moment to surface, to guide me through this process." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Martha said he was the most remarkable animal she'd ever encountered, too intelligent for normal explanations, too devoted for ordinary training methods. She never told me where she found him or how she knew he could do what he did. She just said he understood the mission better than most human operatives." Through the cabin windows, Frank could see the sun rising over the wetlands, painting the water golden and peaceful. Somewhere to the north, Phoenix operatives were searching for him with orders to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. Somewhere in Washington, General Hayes was probably making phone calls, mobilizing resources, preparing to bury the truth one final time. But here in Martha's hidden sanctuary, surrounded by evidence that could expose 40 years of murder and corruption, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since Vietnam: clarity of purpose. His dead brothers deserved justice. The current soldiers being silenced deserved protection, and Martha deserved to see her life's work completed. Rex looked up at him with an expression that seemed to ask a simple question. "Are you ready?" Frank reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the strength and intelligence in that remarkable animal who'd somehow carried the weight of terrible secrets for longer than should have been possible. "Yeah, boy, I'm ready. Let's finish this." The plan should have worked perfectly. Martha had spent 20 years preparing every detail, anticipating every possible complication. The evidence was documented. The media contacts were in place, and Mrs. Henderson had arranged secure channels to deliver the Phoenix files to 3 major newspapers simultaneously. All Frank had to do was follow the script Martha had written, and General Hayes's conspiracy would finally be exposed to the world. But Martha hadn't anticipated that Frank's son David would be part of the Phoenix network. The phone call came at 3:47 in the morning, jolting Frank from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Mrs. Henderson answered on the second ring, her voice instantly alert despite the hour. Frank could hear only one side of the conversation, but her expression told him everything he needed to know. "How did you get this number?" A pause. "I don't care who you work for." Another pause, longer this time. "Put him on." She handed Frank the satellite phone with a look of grim apology. "It's your boy." David's voice sounded exactly the same as it had at Martha's funeral. Controlled, professional, slightly condescending. "Hello, Dad. I think we need to talk." Frank's throat felt dry as desert sand. "Where are you?" "About 2 miles downstream. I've got a team with me, but they're hanging back while we sort this out. I'd prefer to handle this as a family matter." David's tone carried the kind of careful neutrality that Frank recognized from his own military training. "You're in serious trouble, Dad. These people you're working with have filled your head with conspiracy theories and delusions. They're using your grief over Mom to manipulate you into believing things that aren't true." "Which part isn't true, son?" "The part where your unit murdered civilians in Vietnam, or the part where you've been covering it up for 40 years? The silence stretched long enough that Frank wondered if the connection had been lost. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine pain. "Dad, Mom died of cancer. You were there. You held her hand in the hospital. These fantasies about CIA networks and secret documents. It's not healthy. You're having some kind of breakdown, and these people are exploiting your mental state for their own purposes." Frank looked across the cabin at Mrs. Henderson, who was monitoring radio chatter on her communications equipment. Rex lay at Frank's feet, perfectly still but alert, his dark eyes reflecting the glow from the equipment displays. Everything in the cabin was real. The documents, the evidence, the carefully maintained network that had protected Phoenix survivors for decades. But David's voice carried such conviction, such concern, that Frank felt a moment of doubt creep into his mind. What if Martha really had died of cancer and nothing else? What if grief had twisted his memories, made him susceptible to elaborate fantasies? What if Rex was just an unusually intelligent dog, and Frank's loneliness had created connections that didn't exist? "I'm coming up to talk," David continued. "Just me, no weapons, no team. We'll sit down like father and son and figure out how to get you the help you need." Mrs. Henderson was shaking her head violently, pointing to her radio equipment where red lights were flashing in patterns that clearly indicated multiple hostile contacts approaching their position. But David's voice on the phone sounded so reasonable, so concerned, so much like the son Frank remembered from before their relationship had fractured. 30 minutes, Frank said, surprising himself with the decision. "Just you. If I see anyone else, this conversation ends." After he hung up, Mrs. Henderson turned on him with fury in her eyes. "Are you out of your mind? That's a Phoenix operative, Frank. He's probably been monitoring your activities for years. He's my son. He's a trained killer who works for the people who murdered your unit. The same people who've been eliminating Phoenix survivors for 40 years. She gestured toward her equipment. "I'm reading at least 12 heat signatures moving through the swamp toward us. This isn't a family reunion, it's a trap." Rex stood up and moved to the window, his body tense with alertness. The dog's behavior had been Frank's most reliable indicator throughout this entire ordeal, and now Rex was clearly sensing approaching danger. But David was still Frank's son, still the boy Frank had taught to throw a baseball and drive a truck and be a man of honor. "Maybe he doesn't know," Frank said quietly. "Maybe he's been told I'm having a breakdown. Maybe he genuinely thinks he's helping me. Or maybe he's been part of this from the beginning. Maybe your entire relationship with him has been managed by Phoenix operatives who needed someone close to you, someone who could monitor your mental state and eliminate you if you ever started remembering too much." The suggestion hit Frank like a physical blow. Every conversation with David since Martha's death, Every expression of concern about Frank's isolation and financial troubles, every suggestion that maybe it was time to consider assisted living, all of it could have been manipulation by an intelligence network that had been studying him for decades. But David was still his son. The boy Frank had raised, the man who'd served his country in uniform, who'd held Frank's hand at Martha's graveside and promised to stay in touch more often. 20 minutes later, Frank watched through night vision binoculars as a single figure approached the cabin in a small boat, hands clearly visible, no visible weapons. David looked older than Frank remembered, gray starting to show in his hair, lines around his eyes that suggested years of stress and difficult decisions. He moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd spent his career in dangerous situations, but his posture was open, non-threatening. "I'm going out there," Frank announced. Mrs. Henderson grabbed his arm. "Frank, listen to me. In 30 years of intelligence work, I've never seen a Phoenix operative show mercy to a security risk. If your son is really part of their network, he's not here to save you. He's here to eliminate you." Frank looked down at Rex, who was watching the approaching boat with intense focus. The dog's ears were forward, his body alert but not aggressive. If Rex sensed immediate danger, he would be showing different body language. Maybe, but he's still my son, and maybe, just maybe, there's enough of the boy I raised left in him to choose family over orders." Frank opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, feeling the weight of Martha's documents in his jacket pocket and the reassuring presence of Rex at his side. In the distance, he could see David's boat approaching through the cypress trees, a single figure silhouetted against the dawn light. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Frank lived to expose the truth about Operation Phoenix, or whether Martha's 20 years of preparation would die with him in this forgotten corner of the Texas wetlands. But either way, he was going to face it as a father, not as a soldier. Some things were more important than survival. Some relationships were worth the risk of betrayal. And sometimes, the only way to find out who you could trust was to offer your life as proof of your faith in them. David's boat reached the dock, and Frank's son looked up at him with eyes that could have belonged to either a loving family member or a professional killer. "Hello, Dad," David said quietly. "We need to talk." David Mitchell climbed onto the dock with the measured movements of someone who'd spent years in situations where a wrong step could be fatal. He was taller than Frank remembered, his shoulders broader, but his face carried the same stubborn jawline that had gotten him into trouble as a teenager. What was different were his eyes. Cold, calculating, professional. The eyes of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize emotion from duty. "You look tired, Dad," David said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" Frank kept his hand near the pistol Martha had left him, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it on his own son. "Since your mother died, not often. Mom's death hit all of us hard, but this conspiracy theory stuff, it's not healthy. You're seeing connections that don't exist, finding patterns in random events." David took a step closer, his posture non-threatening but alert. "The people who've been filling your head with these stories, they're using your grief to manipulate you." Rex remained at Frank's side, perfectly still but watchful. The dog's behavior was neutral. No aggressive posturing, but no relaxation either. He was evaluating David the same way Frank was, trying to determine whether this was a family reunion or something darker. "Show me your hands, son," Frank said quietly. David raised both hands, palms out, showing no weapons. But Frank noticed the slight bulge beneath his left armpit that suggested a shoulder holster, and the way David positioned himself to maintain clear lines of movement in multiple directions. Professional habits that couldn't be completely suppressed. "Dad, I need you to listen to me carefully. The documents you think you found, the stories about Operation Phoenix, none of it's real. You're having episodes, confusing memories with fantasies. The stress of losing Mom, the financial pressure, the isolation. It's created a perfect storm for this kind of psychological break. Frank studied his son's face, looking for tells that might indicate deception. David had always been a terrible liar as a child, blushing and stumbling over words whenever he tried to avoid responsibility for broken windows or missing cookies. But the man standing on the dock showed no signs of discomfort with his words. "What about the dog tags I found buried on my property? Tommy Morrison, James Riley, all the boys from my unit." David's expression didn't change. "Dad, you buried those yourself. I've been monitoring your activities for months, ever since the neighbors started reporting strange behavior. You've been talking to that dog like it can understand you, digging random holes in your pasture, creating elaborate fantasies about secret government conspiracies." The words hit Frank like physical blows. The certainty he'd felt about Martha's network, about Rex's impossible knowledge, began to waver. What if David was right? What if grief and loneliness had twisted his memories, made him susceptible to delusions that felt more real than reality? But then Rex moved, positioning himself between Frank and David with deliberate intention. The dog's message was clear. This man represents danger, regardless of his relationship to you. "The dog doesn't trust you," Frank observed. "The dog is responding to your anxiety. Animals pick up on emotional states, especially highly intelligent breeds like German Shepherds. You've been living in a constant state of paranoia for weeks. Of course he's agitated." David's explanation was reasonable, logical, delivered with the calm authority of someone stating obvious facts. But something in his tone reminded Frank of Colonel Hayes briefing their unit before Phoenix missions. That same blend of concern and certainty that made soldiers follow orders even when those orders felt wrong. "Why haven't you called in 2 years, David? Why haven't you visited since your mother's funeral?" For the first time, David's professional composure slipped slightly. "I've been deployed. Classified operations in places I can't discuss. I wanted to stay in touch, but operational security required minimal civilian contact." "Bullshit." The word came out harder than Frank intended. "Your mother was dying of cancer for 8 months. No military operation keeps a man from calling his dying mother." David's jaw tightened, and Frank saw a flash of something dangerous in his son's eyes. "You don't know what I've sacrificed for this country. What I've had to give up to serve a mission bigger than family sentiment." There it was, the admission Frank had been dreading. David wasn't here as a concerned son. He was here as a Phoenix operative, following orders that placed national security above family loyalty. "What mission, son? What's so important that you'd let your mother die believing you didn't care about her?" "Protecting American interests from people who would undermine our national security by exposing classified operations." David's voice had gone completely professional now, the concern replaced by cold efficiency. "People like the terrorist sympathizers who convinced you to betray your oath as an American soldier." Frank felt something break inside his chest, a pain worse than Martha's death because this loss was voluntary. His son had chosen duty over family, orders over love, and in making that choice had become exactly the kind of man Frank had fought against in every war he'd ever known. "I never betrayed my oath, David. I followed orders, even when those orders meant killing innocent people. I carried that guilt for 40 years, and your mother spent our entire marriage trying to help me find a way to make it right. Mom died of cancer, Dad. She wasn't some CIA operative. She was a school teacher who loved you despite your psychological problems." But Frank was remembering now, details he'd suppressed coming back with painful clarity. Martha's questions about his nightmares, her gentle probing about specific missions, her insistence on certain financial arrangements that had never made sense at the time. David was lying about Martha, which meant he was probably lying about everything else. Rex suddenly went rigid. His head turned toward the swamp where Mrs. Henderson was monitoring from the cabin. 3 short, sharp barks, a warning signal that Martha had taught him, according to the notes Frank had found. multiple hostiles approaching. David heard the barks, too, and his hand moved toward his concealed weapon with reflexive speed. "Dad, we need to end this conversation now. Come with me voluntarily, and I can guarantee you'll receive proper medical treatment. Resist, and the situation becomes much more complicated." "Complicated how?" "There are 12 operators positioned around this location. They have orders to eliminate any security risks, but I convinced them to let me try talking to you first. Family loyalty." David's voice carried bitter irony. "I thought maybe I could save you from the consequences of your choices." Frank understood now why Martha had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. She'd known that eventually the Phoenix network would reach even into their family, would turn David against his own father in service of protecting institutional secrets. She'd known that Frank would have to choose between his son and justice for his murdered brothers. "What about Rex?" Frank asked, his hand moving to rest on the dog's head. "What happens to him?" David glanced at the German Shepherd with clinical assessment. "The animal will be evaluated for security risks. If he's been trained to locate classified materials, he'll be handled appropriately." The euphemism was clear enough. Rex would be eliminated along with Frank, probably cremated to prevent any investigation into his remarkable abilities and impossible longevity. Frank looked down at the dog who'd guided him through Martha's carefully planned revelation, who'd showed him burial sites and hidden truths with patient intelligence that defied normal explanation. Rex was watching David with alert wariness, but when Frank's hand touched his head, the dog's tail moved slightly, not wagging but acknowledging the connection between them. "I can't do it, son," Frank said quietly. "I can't let you murder the last witness to what really happened in Vietnam. Even if that witness has 4 legs and can't speak for himself." David drew his sidearm with smooth efficiency, holding it in a low, ready position that suggested extensive training. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. You're sick. You need help. But if you continue down this path, I won't be able to protect you from the consequences." Frank realized that his son genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. David had been so thoroughly conditioned by the Phoenix network that he couldn't distinguish between institutional loyalty and moral obligation. He'd become the perfect operative, someone who could eliminate his own father while convincing himself it was an act of mercy. The sound of boats moving through the swamp grew louder, and Frank could see muzzle flashes in the distance where Mrs. Henderson was apparently engaging the approaching operatives. Whatever Martha's network had planned for this contingency, it was happening now. Rex pressed against Frank's leg, solid and warm and real. Whatever else was true, whatever delusions Frank might be harboring, the dog's loyalty was authentic. Rex had chosen to stand with Frank against overwhelming odds, just as Frank's brothers had stood with him in Vietnam before the Phoenix conspiracy had them murdered. "I love you, David," Frank said, meaning every word despite everything that had happened. "But I can't let you complete this mission. Too many good men have died to protect these secrets already." David raised his weapon, tears streaming down his face but his hands steady as stone. "I love you too, Dad. That's why I'm going to make this quick." The shot that rang out across the swamp didn't come from David's gun. The bullet caught David in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying into the murky water below the dock. He dropped to one knee, clutching his wounded arm, his face a mask of shock and pain. Behind him, Mrs. Henderson emerged from the cypress trees with a smoking rifle in her hands and grim satisfaction in her eyes. "Should have taken the shot when you had the chance, boy," she said, keeping her weapon trained on David while scanning the swamp for additional threats. "Martha always said you were too much like your father, too decent to be a proper killer." Frank rushed to David's side, his paternal instincts overriding everything else. The wound was bleeding heavily, but didn't appear to have hit bone or major arteries. David looked up at his father with confusion and betrayal, as if he couldn't understand how the situation had reversed so completely. "Dad, what are you doing? These people are terrorists. They're manipulating you." "No, son. They're the people your mother worked with for 20 years to document what really happened to my unit in Vietnam." Frank helped David apply pressure to the wound, his hands gentle despite everything that had transpired. "You've been lied to about who the real terrorists are." Mrs. Henderson moved to a better defensive position, her attention split between watching for approaching operatives and monitoring the father-son reunion. "Frank, we've got maybe 5 minutes before this place is crawling with Phoenix teams. Whatever you're going to tell him, make it fast." Frank pulled out Martha's documents, the evidence she'd spent decades gathering, and spread them in front of David. "Look at these, son. Really look at them. Your mother wasn't a school teacher who died of cancer. She was a CIA analyst who spent our entire marriage investigating Operation Phoenix. She faked her death to protect both of us from the people you work for." David's eyes widened as he recognized official CIA letterhead, classified stamps, and photographs that connected Phoenix operatives to decades of cover-ups and eliminations. "This can't be real. Mom died in the hospital. I was there. I held her hand." "That was someone else, David. Someone Martha's network arranged to take her place while she went into deep cover." Frank's voice broke as he revealed the truth he'd only recently learned himself. "Your mother has been alive for 2 years, hiding in witness protection, waiting for the right moment to expose Phoenix and come home to us." The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Rex began barking in short, urgent bursts that clearly indicated imminent danger. Mrs. Henderson shouldered her rifle and began moving toward a concealed boat hidden deeper in the cypress grove. "Time's up, Frank. We need to move now if we want to live through the next hour." David struggled to his feet, his face pale from blood loss and shock. "Even if what you're saying is true about Mom, I can't just abandon my unit. These men are counting on me to complete the mission." "Your mission is to murder your own father and destroy evidence of war crimes that reach back 40 years. Frank grabbed David by his uninjured arm, forcing eye contact. "When did that become something you could live with?" For the first time since arriving, David's professional composure completely cracked. Tears mixed with sweat on his face as he looked at the documents scattered around them. At Rex, who was watching him with intelligent assessment. At his father, who was offering forgiveness even after being betrayed. "I thought I was protecting national security." "They showed me psychiatric evaluations. Told me you were having a complete breakdown, that you were being manipulated by foreign agents who wanted to embarrass the United States. And you believed them because it was easier than believing your father might be telling the truth about something that would destroy your career and your unit." Frank's voice carried no anger, only sadness. "I understand, son. I followed orders I knew were wrong for the same reasons." The first helicopter appeared over the tree line, searchlights cutting through the morning mist like laser beams. Mrs. Henderson was already in her escape boat, engine running, gesturing frantically for Frank and Rex to join her. "Frank, now or never." Frank looked at his wounded son, then at Rex, who was still maintaining his protective position between Frank and potential threats. The dog's dark eyes seemed to hold a question. "Are we leaving him behind?" "Come with us, David," Frank said, extending his hand. "Help us expose the truth about Phoenix. Help us get justice for all the men who died to protect these secrets." David looked at his father's outstretched hand, then at the approaching helicopters where his unit was preparing to eliminate what they believed were terrorist threats. "If I go with you, I'll be branded a traitor, court-martialed, imprisoned, maybe killed by my own people. If you don't come with us, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you chose institutional loyalty over family love, and eventually Phoenix will eliminate you too, because operatives who show mercy to security risks become security risks themselves." The helicopters were close enough now that Frank could see rappel ropes being deployed. In seconds, the swamp would be crawling with heavily armed operators who had orders to kill everyone present. David made his choice. He grabbed his father's hand and allowed himself to be pulled toward Mrs. Henderson's boat, Rex bounding alongside them through the shallow water. As they reached the vessel, automatic weapons fire erupted from the approaching helicopters, bullets churning the water around them and splintering cypress bark like deadly confetti. Mrs. Henderson gunned the engine and sent them racing through waterways so narrow the boat's sides scraped against overhanging branches. Behind them, Frank could hear radio chatter and the whine of helicopter rotors as Phoenix teams coordinated their pursuit. "Where are we going?" David shouted over the engine noise, pressing a makeshift bandage against his shoulder wound. "To see your mother," Mrs. Henderson called back. "She's been waiting 2 years to hold both her men again." Rex positioned himself at the bow of the boat, ears forward, scanning for obstacles and threats with the focused intensity of a point man leading a patrol through enemy territory. The dog's behavior suggested he'd been through similar escapes before, that this wasn't his first time running from Phoenix operatives through hostile terrain. As they navigated deeper into the wetlands, following channels that didn't appear on any official maps, Frank realized that Martha's network had been preparing for this moment since the day she'd first discovered the truth about Operation Phoenix. Every safe house, every escape route, every contingency plan had been designed to protect her family and expose the conspiracy that had been murdering American soldiers for 40 years. The sound of pursuit began to fade as they moved into waterways too narrow for helicopters and too shallow for military patrol boats. Mrs. Henderson guided them through a landscape that seemed untouched by the modern world, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks and alligators sunned themselves on fallen logs. "How long has she been alive?" David asked, his voice barely audible over the engine. "Since the day after her funeral," Frank replied. "The woman we buried was a Jane Doe from Austin, someone who died of the same cancer your mother was supposed to have. Martha's network arranged the substitution to give her time to complete her investigation without Phoenix knowing she was still operational." David closed his eyes, processing the enormity of the deception. 2 years. She let us grieve for her for 2 years while she was alive and hiding. She let us grieve to keep us safe. If Phoenix had known she was still alive, they would have used us as leverage to force her into the open. Frank watched his son struggle with the revelation. Everything she did was to protect us and to ensure that the truth about your brothers in arms wouldn't die with her. Rex suddenly barked twice, then stood perfectly still, another signal Frank had learned to recognize. Target acquired. Safe harbor ahead. Around the next bend, hidden beneath a canopy of willows that made it invisible from the air, sat a houseboat that looked like something out of a travel magazine. Solar panels provided power, a satellite dish ensured communications, and gardens growing on floating platforms showed signs of long-term habitation. Standing on the deck, wearing jeans and a Texas Rangers t-shirt, her hair longer and grayer than Frank remembered, but her smile exactly the same, was Martha Mitchell. She was alive. She was real. She was home. Rex launched himself from the moving boat before Mrs. Henderson had even cut the engine, swimming the final yards to reach Martha with joyful determination. She knelt on the dock and embraced the dog who had carried her secrets and protected her family with impossible loyalty. Frank helped David out of the boat, both men moving with the careful deliberation of people who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Martha straightened slowly, tears streaming down her face, her arms open wide enough to embrace both the husband she'd left behind and the son she'd died to protect. "Hello, boys," she said, her voice carrying all the love and longing of 2 years in hiding. "Welcome home." The reunion on Martha's floating sanctuary lasted only minutes before the practical realities of survival reasserted themselves. Phoenix helicopters were still searching the wetlands, and David's shoulder wound needed proper medical attention. But for those precious few minutes, Frank held his wife in his arms while their son embraced them both, and Rex sat at their feet with his tail finally wagging like a normal, happy dog. "We can't stay here," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion but steady with purpose. "Phoenix will expand their search grid within the hour. David's tracking beacon will lead them right to us." David pulled back from the family embrace, his face pale but resolute. "I disabled my beacon before we left the cabin, but they'll notice the dead signal soon enough, maybe 30 minutes before they triangulate our last known position." Martha looked at her son with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. "You chose us over your orders. That took more courage than anything you've ever done in uniform." "I chose the truth over lies," David replied. "But I still don't understand how you survived." "I saw you die, Mom. I held your hand in that hospital room." Martha gestured toward the houseboat's interior, where medical equipment and communication devices suggested she'd been running a sophisticated operation for months. CIA facial reconstruction, genetic modification of dental records, falsified medical histories. "The woman you buried was a volunteer, a terminal cancer patient who wanted her death to serve a greater purpose. She knew she was helping expose war crimes that reached into the highest levels of government." Frank stared at his wife, realizing the full scope of what she'd sacrificed for this mission. "You lived with that knowledge for 2 years? Knowing we thought you were dead? Every day, every night. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the only way to keep you both safe while we gathered the final evidence we needed." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I watched David's graduation from Quantico through binoculars. I was at your 67th birthday dinner, Frank, sitting 3 tables away, wearing a disguise and praying you wouldn't recognize me." Rex moved to Martha's side and pressed against her leg, offering the same comfort he'd provided Frank during the darkest moments of their journey. The dog seemed to understand that this reunion, however joyful, was taking place under the shadow of mortal danger. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the houseboat's pilot house with grim news. "Phoenix teams are coordinating with local law enforcement. They've got roadblocks on every highway within 50 miles, and they're calling in favors with the Coast Guard to patrol the waterways." "Then we go to ground," Martha said, her CIA training taking over. "Deep cover until we can coordinate simultaneous media releases in 6 major cities. The evidence is too comprehensive to suppress if it hits multiple outlets at once." David shook his head. "They'll never let it get that far. Phoenix has assets in every major news organization, contacts in the Justice Department, influence in congressional oversight committees. They've been covering up war crimes for 40 years. They know how to manage media narratives." "Not this time," Frank said quietly, pulling Martha's most damning documents from his jacket. "Your mother didn't just gather evidence about Vietnam. She documented the entire evolution of Phoenix operations, from the original war crimes through current elimination programs. She's got recordings, financial records, photographs that connect Phoenix operatives to defense contractors, politicians, and military leadership going back decades." Martha nodded. "Phoenix isn't just covering up old crimes anymore. They're committing new ones, using the same elimination techniques on current military personnel who report war crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, whistleblowers, journalists, congressional investigators, anyone who gets too close to the truth." David's face went white as he processed the implications. "My unit, the operations we've been running, Jesus Christ, we're not fighting terrorism. We're enforcing institutional silence. You're fighting for the same corrupt system that murdered your father's brothers in arms 40 years ago," Martha said gently. "But now you have a choice. Help us expose the truth or spend the rest of your life wondering how many good soldiers died because you chose institutional loyalty over moral courage. The sound of approaching boats interrupted their conversation. Multiple engines moving fast, coordinating their approach with military precision. Rex immediately went to alert status, positioning himself between the family and the direction of the threat. "Underground bunker," Martha said, leading them toward what appeared to be a storage compartment, but open to reveal a concealed stairway leading below the waterline. "Built this myself over 6 months. Air filtration, communications equipment, supplies for 2 weeks." As they descended into Martha's hidden sanctuary, Frank realized his wife had been preparing for this confrontation with the same methodical thoroughness she'd brought to every aspect of their marriage. The bunker was a masterpiece of concealment and survival planning, equipped with everything they would need to coordinate a global media campaign while staying hidden from the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world. "David, I need you to contact every reporter, every congressional oversight staffer, every human rights advocate on this list," Martha said, handing him a tablet loaded with secure communication software. "Simultaneous releases in Washington, New York, Los Angeles, London, Geneva, and Brussels. Phoenix can suppress American media, but they can't control international coverage." David looked at the list of contacts, recognizing names of journalists and investigators who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about military operations for years. "If I do this, there's no going back. I'll be branded a traitor by everyone I've ever served with." "You'll be branded a hero by history," Frank said, placing his hand on his son's uninjured shoulder. "The same way the soldiers who exposed the My Lai massacre were eventually recognized as patriots who refused to let war crimes continue in their name." Rex moved to David's side and sat perfectly still, looking up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold decades of patience and understanding. The dog's presence was somehow reassuring, a reminder that loyalty didn't always mean following orders, that sometimes the most courageous choice was to stand against the very institutions you'd sworn to serve. Above them, Frank could hear footsteps on the houseboat deck, voices coordinating search patterns, the creak of equipment being moved around. Phoenix operatives were conducting a thorough investigation of Martha's floating sanctuary, but they were searching for fugitives, not for a bunker that had been designed by one of their own former analysts. 2 hours, Martha whispered, monitoring the activity above through concealed cameras. "That's how long it will take to coordinate releases with 6 major international news outlets. Can you stay quiet that long, boy?" She was talking to Rex, but the dog seemed to understand the question. He settled into a comfortable lying position and rested his head on his paws, demonstrating the kind of disciplined patience that suggested extensive training in covert operations. As they waited in Martha's underground sanctuary, surrounded by evidence that would expose 40 years of war crimes and murder, Frank reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion at an animal shelter. He'd bought an old dog out of pity, never imagining that the animal would guide him through a labyrinth of buried secrets and family betrayals to this moment of truth. Rex lifted his head and looked at Frank with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity. The dog had carried impossible burdens for longer than any creature should have to endure, protecting secrets that could have died with him if Frank hadn't made that impulsive decision to spend his last $38 on an animal nobody else wanted. Now, in a bunker beneath the Texas wetlands, surrounded by his family and preparing to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government, Frank understood that some acts of kindness echo across decades, creating connections that transcend normal understanding of loyalty and love. Whatever happened when those Phoenix operatives finished their search and moved on, whatever consequences followed from David's decision to choose truth over orders, they would face it together, a family reunited by courage, protected by sacrifice, and guided by a remarkable dog whose loyalty had somehow transcended every limitation of species and time. At any age, We can choose to open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. We can choose to believe that redemption, reunion, and joy are still waiting for us, even when life has knocked us down. Sometimes salvation comes with 4 legs and a wagging tail, teaching us that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. Interaction. Questions. Have you ever had a pet that seemed almost too intelligent, like they understood more than they should? What's the most unexpected way someone or something has brought healing to your life?